back again. Wanted to do a short video, it won't be short, but on the editing interface for Novillo. I did a video about getting to the point where we had opened up the editing interface. At that point, the editing interface looks pretty much the way it does now, but it was not really ready for showtime. And it still is a work in progress, but I can show you enough of it that it's kind of worth taking some time to do that. So let's talk a little bit about what we're focusing on. We're going to focus on the palette, which is the core interface element in Novillo. This is a really deliberate design decision to make a very compact interface component that would not get in the way of whatever you were working on and leave you like sort of with a clear view of the work you're trying to achieve. But that does make the compression of the interface pretty tight and makes some harder design choices. So you have to figure out a way to make everything work in a lot of different contexts and still be clear. It's a little bit of a learning curve interface, but as little as I could make it. So, as I said, if I pointed us or in the previous video, if I pointed this in a previous video or not, I can't remember, but there are 4 sections to the palette corresponding to the 4 buttons at the top right. And I showed how the first 3 organize the material that goes into your Novillo. So basically, we can see the different components here of media, text, we saw that briefly, and blocks. And then we took a very short look at the selection component of the composition section, which is the doorway, if you like, to editing. So that's a starting point for where we are today. So the editing functions are only accessible from the composition area and only when you have selected a thread and an event inside that thread. So that little pop-up palette at the bottom there, a panel, gives you a way to select that, and from there we can just go to the palette, swipe the composition word in the lozenge, and now we're in the editing mode, ready to do whatever changes we want to do to the selected components that are part of this thread. So I think that the last couple of videos before this one, I was mostly concerned with telling you that what I was trying to do was build the collision detection and avoidance mechanism that needs to go in here. This is the mechanism that ensures that only one event is changing any of the elements inside of the drawings and elements inside the composition at any given time. We don't want any conflicts because that leads to erratic behavior. So basically, we have to have a mechanism for doing that. For the most part, different threads keep things separate, so we don't get those collisions because threads have priorities depending on how finely you've selected something that has a higher priority, and often they're selecting different things altogether. But within a given thread, events can overlap, which could be a problem, so we have to detect that and then take action. So the detection mechanism is working, and I showed that in a video 2 videos ago or something, and it's still working, so it's fine. Next, though, was the conflict avoidance mechanism, and ideally, for one event not to conflict with another event, it just has to end before the other event begins, and there won't be any problems. Now, in Novillo, each event starts at a particular endpoint, so we have one in this demo at 0, and we have another one at 37 endpoints in, or steps in. At the time that I was starting to build the avoidance mechanism, each event also had a single out point. You'd say how long it was going to be, and that was true for everything in it. So that made the job really, really simple. But then, you kind of get into the specifics of something, and it turns out that there's a little bit more to it than you had thought, and we call this recognizing nuances. This is a really crucial part of adding useless, time-consuming, and irritating features to any app, is to be aware of these nuances. And this is pretty much a specialty of mine. So I specialize in stupid, complex features, but in this case, somewhat disappointingly, there was some nuance that made it likely that this would be a good thing to address and build into the interface, make it more usable, more functional app. So I made these changes, and I'll show you them in a second, and now an event still has a definitive out point. You can see it right now in that yellow field, which says, I think, 94. That hasn't changed, and that's the reference point for event collision detection. But I'm doing it a little bit differently now. So basically, the original idea was very simple. 2 numbers, in point, out point, good, we're good. But what I decided was that each attribute within the given event should have its own out point. So it could run on its own time scale, if you like. So you can see here what that looks like. We start off where all of the attributes have the same endpoint, which is the default behavior before. You can see that number in the yellow doesn't change. But we can now change each one individually. So it means that whatever changes are being made will end at or before that time. So now we have an amalgam of different out points, but it doesn't really change anything because basically the length of the event is simply the longest, the greatest out point that there is that marks the duration of the entire event. So not a change in terms of what comes next, but the underlying mechanism has changed. So it's great. So now I can start working on the event avoidance mechanism, which is one of the important parts of making sure Novillo is useful and predictable as a tool. So what do we want to say after that? Well, there we go. Sorry, a little break there. So getting this mechanism working also meant that all the attributes could still be given the same out point. That can happen in a lot of cases. You want it to be the case that the line weight changes over the same time scale as the line color changes, or the opacity changes at the same rate that the background color changes, or all of them together. And so we needed a simple mechanism for doing that. So basically, this is still doable because when more than one attribute is selected, as in the case of all of them here, we can modify the value, and we can also modify for any subgroup. So this is a way to make sure that we can synchronize these events across multiple categories really easily, or then just choose one or several to give their own event out point to. So this is one of the kind of challenges in the interface to figure out how to make this kind of stuff work smoothly within the resources you've got, not add lots of new buttons and so forth. Okay, so all this works well, and while it's not, I would say, completely intuitive, it's the kind of thing that a user can play around with, experiment with, no damage done, figure out, what they're getting out of this, and we'll build some tutorials and it'll be easier enough to understand. I just wanted to talk about a couple of other features that are like that. There's one that I haven't mentioned so far that's a function built around those orange bars you see around the editing area. So these are going to be a crucial part of how we can build a degree of variability, randomness, unpredictability. There's different names and ways you might want to think about this. But basically, what this depends on is that these orange bars can be used to vary the time frame of the in point, vary the time frame of the out point. So that was the in point. This is the variation within that. This is the variation of the out point. This is the variation. This is the variation of the out point. The previous one was the out point. All these things don't actually change that event envelope number, the out point, but they are going to play in a really interesting way into creating more flexibility in Novillo to allow creators to have more latitude for interesting and in some ways unpredicted, but still enveloped, or if you want to say limited, changes in the events. So, as I say, none of this affects what I have to do the collision avoidance stuff, which is what starts next. And if you remember that incredibly great graphic that I showed the other day, that was really good. You'll know that I've been doing a lot of thinking about this over the last little while, and it's this is sort of explaining the same thing in a little easier way because things are working in the interface now. In the example that we have been looking at, I'll just talk a little bit about how this actually plays out on the collision detection front. We have one event that runs from 0 to 37, and another one that runs from 0 to a number determined by the out points of the different attributes. But currently, the number of even the earliest attribute is much higher than the in point for the next event. So there's a collision. So what do we do in that case? This is what I have to think about now. This is our dilemma. So for line weight, which we've been thinking about as our primary way of demoing the software, one way to prevent the next event from altering the value of the line weight is to just prevent it from doing so. You open up the second event, you try to change the line weight, we would say no go because the previous event runs into this space of this event and you can't change it. Another way to handle it is what you might do is to say, okay, you can trim back the previous event so that it ends its changes at the end point of this event. So this would work well, but the problem would be that it would cause in this case anyway, where it goes from 92 or 98 or whatever, the number of ticks for that particular event, down to suddenly 37 and actually 36, that's going to be the line weight changing at 3 times the rate. That might not fit in with the aesthetics that the individual creating the Novillo is interested in, and so that could create its own problems, but they can go in and change it anyway, and they'll be reviewing it, so I don't think it's the end of the world. And there's always the option of just having an alert saying, do you want to not do it at all, or do you want to trim the previous one? And that's an easy option to provide, just put it in the hands of the user. Either way, it's something that they can make a decision on their own. So, kind of wrapping this up now, that represents an example of all the preparatory work that you have to do to get to the point where you're trying to do the thing you thought you were going to be doing, a week ago, which everyone remembers my my sage assessment of what that was all about. And that's actually really easy. That's a line of code I'll add. What is hard is getting all of the conditionalities right, and that's what the last 48 hours have been about. Getting a conceptual map. It's how programming works.
When I showed you at the beginning.
Okay, I guess, I hope that the next video will really actually be about the creation of the edit collision, the event collision, and the beginning of the mechanisms to prevent that. That'll be a really important part of the Novillo app because it's going to prevent the most obvious problem that exists right now and actually just doing what it's supposed to do. From then, having solved that for something like line weight, I'll start to expand that out to all the other attributes. Last will probably be the line drawing changes, but that is just because there's more than one variable going on in there. I want to do the simple ones first. Nevertheless, I feel like we're making good progress. I feel like it's a lot of work. I've been at this for about 5 months now, pretty much all the time. But on the other hand, 5 months to get to this stage, I'm pretty happy. Okay, Dan Donaldson, the Novillo comic fellow. See you again real soon, I hope. Bye.